Have you ever stared into a painting and felt like something inside it was watching you? For Alaric Donovan, an art collector who spent his life surrounded by rare and priceless masterpieces, the answer to that question was once a firm no. Until one fateful night, when everything changed. It started like any other evening. Alaric was alone in his private gallery, admiring his latest acquisition, a serene landscape he had recently restored. But something felt wrong. The air seemed heavy, almost oppressive, and the gallery, usually filled with soft, golden light, felt suffocating. As his eyes scanned the room, they were drawn to a painting in the corner, one he had seen 100 times before. Except now, it was different. The once calm, idyllic scene had transformed. The sky, once bright and clear, now churned with dark, stormy clouds. The river that ran through the landscape appeared swollen, angry, as if it had been stirred by unseen forces. But the most chilling change was a figure, one that wasn't there before. Hidden in the shadow of the trees, it stood, barely visible but unmistakably human, its head slightly tilted, as if watching. A cold shiver ran down Alaric's spine, the kind of chill that burrows deep into your bones. His heart raced. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, convinced it was some trick of the mind, a result of too many late nights spent obsessing over his collection. But no, the figure remained, unmoving, watching. Something about the scene felt alive, more than just paint on canvas. Alaric approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the hollow room. The closer he got, the stronger the sense of dread became. His breath quickened. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, but he couldn't stop himself. He reached out to touch the frame, and for a split second, he swore the wood was warm, as if it had a pulse of its own. Panic surged through him. What was happening? Was he losing his mind? Or was there something far more sinister lurking within the art he loved? Before the terror unfolds further, make sure you're subscribed and have hit that like button. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next in this chilling tale. That night, Alaric couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Sleep came slowly, tugging him into a restless slumber filled with strange, unsettling visions. In the dream, he found himself back in his gallery, standing alone in the dim light. The paintings, once a source of pride and beauty, now loomed over him like silent sentinels, their frames casting long, sinister shadows across the room. The air was thick with the smell of wet paint and something far more unpleasant, decay. It was as if the very essence of the art had soured, rotting from the inside out. His footsteps echoed unnaturally in the stillness, louder than they should have been, and with each step, the temperature seemed to drop. As Alaric moved deeper into the gallery, the paintings began to change. Their serene landscapes twisted into grotesque versions of themselves, fields of flowers now burned, blackened, and lifeless. The peaceful rivers he once admired ran thick with something dark, almost blood-like, as if the paintings were bleeding their truths into his reality. The whispers started softly, barely perceptible, like the faint rustling of wind through leaves. But there was no wind. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the voices were calling to him from within the canvases themselves. His pulse quickened, every nerve in his body screaming for him to wake up, to run, but he was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by an invisible force. Then he saw it, the same shadowy figure from before, lurking in the painting that had haunted him earlier. But now, it wasn't just a figure in the distance. It had moved. The figure was closer, almost stepping out of the trees, its face still obscured, but its presence unmistakable. Alaric could feel its gaze piercing through him, watching, waiting. He tried to turn away, but his body betrayed him, moving closer to the painting instead. The figure's arm twitched, a subtle movement, but enough to make his heart stop. The dream felt too real, too vivid. The sounds, the smells, the oppressive atmosphere, it all pressed down on him like suffocating weight. His hand reached out, shaking uncontrollably as he touched the canvas. It was no longer just paint and fabric. It felt slick, wet, like something alive was pulsating beneath the surface. His fingers recoiled, but it was too late. The figure began to step forward, emerging from the painting, its form distorted and unnatural, like a creature breaking free from a prison it had been trapped in for centuries. Alaric screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. The last thing he saw before waking was the figure's hollow, empty eyes staring back at him, as if it had been waiting for him all along. His eyes snapped open, drenched in sweat, heart racing. But the dream wasn't over. The real nightmare had just begun. Alaric jolted awake, his body trembling, the remnants of the dream still clinging to his consciousness like a thick fog. He sat up in bed, drenched in cold sweat, his breaths shallow and ragged. The room around him was dark and silent, yet something felt terribly off. His heart pounded against his chest as he glanced at the clock on his nightstand. 3:13 a.m., the witching hour, a time when, according to old folklore, the veil between the world of the living and the dead is at its thinnest. Alaric had never believed in such superstitions before, but after what he had just experienced, he wasn't so sure anymore. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, moving in the corners of his vision, but whenever he looked directly at them, they were still. It was the same oppressive sensation from his dream. The air was thick, heavy, and the silence felt alive, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. Alaric threw off the covers and stumbled to his feet, determined to shake off the irrational fear that had gripped him. But when he opened the door to his bedroom, the hallway beyond was cloaked in unnatural darkness. His heart skipped a beat. It was as though the light had been sucked from the house, leaving only a void in its place. Against his better judgment, Alaric made his way to the gallery. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, too loud, too sharp, as if the very walls were amplifying the sound. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the shadows seemed to mock him, daring him to turn back. But he couldn't. He had to see the painting again. He had to know if what he had seen in the dream was somehow real. As he entered the gallery, his breath caught in his throat. The room was dimly lit by the pale moonlight streaming through the high windows, casting eerie patterns across the floor. And there was the painting, the one that had haunted him in his dreams, but was no longer the same peaceful landscape he had once cherished. The storm clouds had grown darker, swirling with ominous energy. The river was now a torrent, raging with an unnatural ferocity. And the figure, it had moved. The shadowy figure, once hidden in the distance, now stood at the very edge of the canvas, its form more defined, though its face remained obscured. Alaric's stomach twisted with dread. His mind screamed that this couldn't be possible. Paintings didn't change on their own. They were static, frozen in time. But there was undeniable proof that something was terribly wrong. As he approached the painting, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and a faint whisper echoed in the back of his mind. Indistinct, unintelligible, but persistent, like a voice trying to break through from another realm. Alaric stopped inches from the painting, his eyes locked on the figure. The shadows seemed to writhe around it, as if they were alive, shifting and swirling in a grotesque dance. His hands trembled as he reached out, desperate to prove that this was all just a trick of the mind, that he wasn't losing his grip on reality. But as his fingers brushed the surface of the canvas, the texture was no longer smooth. It was wet, slick, as though the painting itself was bleeding. Suddenly, the figure moved, not in a way that was visible, but Alaric felt it. An imperceptible shift, like something inside the painting was watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw the figure smile, though its face remained hidden in shadow. Panic surged through him. He stumbled back, his heart racing, as the room seemed to close in around him. The walls felt closer, the air thicker, and the shadows seemed to be crawling toward him. He turned and fled, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the now oppressive silence. But as he ran, the whisper followed him, growing louder, more distinct, until it was no longer just a whisper. It was a voice that called his name, Alaric Donovan. That night, sleep didn't come easy for Alaric. Even after fleeing the gallery, he could still feel the presence of the figure lurking in the back of his mind, as if it had followed him into his very thoughts. He fought to keep his eyes open, terrified of what awaited him in the darkness of his dreams. But exhaustion finally took hold, and once again, he found himself standing in the gallery, surrounded by the ominous presence of his paintings. Except this time, something was different. The paintings had shifted even further. What once were landscapes now depicted twisted, nightmarish versions of themselves. Fields were scorched and barren, rivers turned black, and skies choked with ash. It was as if the art was slowly decaying, mirroring some unseen rot that had taken hold of his life. The room was colder than before. Each breath Alaric took forming clouds of mist in front of him. The oppressive weight of the dream bore down on him harder, making every step feel sluggish and heavy. He moved toward the painting that had haunted him from the start, the one that had begun this nightmare. But now the entire gallery seemed warped, as though reality itself was bending around him. The walls stretched unnaturally, the ceiling loomed higher, and the paintings seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The shadows that had once crawled in the corners now danced openly, swirling like dark tendrils around his feet, teasing him, beckoning him closer. He stopped in front of the painting. The figure that had once been hidden within the shadows was now fully visible, standing at the edge of the canvas, as if poised to step through. Its face was still obscured, a deep void where its features should have been, but there was no mistaking the intent. It was watching him. The whispers that had followed him before returned, louder now, more coherent. They weren't just random voices anymore. They were calling his name over and over, in a chorus of unnerving, disembodied tones. Alaric, Alaric. His heart raced as he reached out toward the painting once more, feeling compelled by some invisible force. As his hand hovered over the canvas, the figure suddenly moved, its head snapping up to face him directly. Alaric stumbled back in horror, but it was too late. The figure stepped out of the painting, its body twisting unnaturally as it crossed the threshold from canvas into reality. It was no longer confined to the art. It was here, with him. Alaric's scream caught in his throat as the figure moved closer, its limbs jerking and contorting as if it didn't belong in this world. Its body was a grotesque imitation of a human form, its movements sharp and disjointed, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. The air around it crackled with an unnatural energy, making the hairs on the back of Alaric's neck stand on end. He tried to back away, but his legs felt heavy, as though the floor itself was gripping him, holding him in place. The figure reached out with one long, skeletal hand, its fingers stretching impossibly far. Alaric was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to even breathe, as the figure's hand grazed his skin. It was cold, so cold it burned, like the touch of death itself. His vision blurred, and for a brief moment, he felt like he was being pulled into the painting, into that twisted, decaying world on the other side. Time slowed, and the whispers in his head grew deafening, filling every corner of his mind with an unbearable cacophony of voices. He couldn't tell if they were trying to warn him or beckon him deeper into the nightmare. Just as the figure's fingers closed around his wrist, there was a violent snap, like the shattering of glass. Alaric was thrown backward, hitting the floor with a painful thud. He gasped for air, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. The gallery was silent again, the oppressive weight of the dream gone, but the figure remained. It stood at the edge of the painting, now frozen, as if it had been stopped mid-step. But the terror wasn't over. Alaric scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and stared at the painting. Something was different. In the corner of the painting, where the figure had once been, he now saw a reflection, asterisk his own reflection star. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The figure, the one that had haunted him, wasn't just some ghostly entity. It was him, or at least, it was becoming him. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. But the nightmare had left a mark on reality. As he looked around his room, he saw it, a faint shadow in the corner, something lingering just out of sight. The figure from the painting had followed him into the waking world, and now it was here, watching. Wait. The morning light did little to dispel the creeping dread that had followed Alaric from his dream. His skin prickled with unease, the feeling of being watched never quite fading. He forced himself to get up, convincing his rational mind that it had all been a nightmare. But as he passed by the gallery, on his way to the kitchen, something made him stop. His heart skipped a beat. The door to the gallery, which he was sure he had closed the night before, was slightly ajar. A cold draft seeped out, as if the room itself was breathing. Alaric hesitated before stepping inside, every instinct telling him to stay away. Yet, driven by a grim compulsion, he pushed the door open and entered. The gallery was just as he left it, or so he thought. The paintings lined the walls in their usual places, but something was wrong, subtly but disturbingly wrong. His eyes were drawn immediately to the painting that had haunted his dreams. The figure that had once emerged from the canvas was now back inside, but it had moved again. It was standing at the forefront, as if closer than ever before. But this time, there was something new. In the background of the painting, barely noticeable at first, was a house. Asterisk his house star. The detail was unmistakable. The ivy-covered walls, the crooked fence, even the cracked window pane in the upper corner. Alaric's stomach twisted with nausea. How could this be? He had never noticed the house before, and it certainly hadn't been there when he first acquired the painting. He leaned in closer, squinting at the scene, trying to understand how it was possible. As he stared, the sensation of being watched intensified, crawling over his skin like hundreds of unseen eyes. His pulse quickened as he turned to inspect the rest of the gallery. More paintings had changed. Where once peaceful landscapes had existed, now there were subtle but horrifying alterations. The river in one painting, which had once flowed serenely, was now stained red. In another, the figure of a woman, once depicted gazing wistfully into the distance, now appeared to be screaming, her face twisted in agony. Each painting seemed to have taken on a life of its own, warping into something darker, more sinister. But the most disturbing detail was that many of these new scenes bore an uncanny resemblance to places from Alaric's life. The streets he used to walk as a child, the park where he had his first kiss, all were now twisted, filled with grotesque and horrifying details. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The figure, the house, the changing paintings. This was no ordinary collection. The art was feeding off of his life, his memories, turning them into nightmarish reflections. Alaric's breath hitched as he realized something even more chilling. The events depicted in the paintings were unfolding in chronological order, as if the artwork was documenting his life and his future. Desperate for answers, Alaric scoured his records, searching for any clue about the origins of the cursed painting. Hours passed as he dug through dusty files and documents. Eventually, he found what he was looking for, a name, scrawled in faded ink on the back of an old acquisition sheet, Antonius Merrick. The name sent a chill down his spine. Merrick was a little-known artist from the late 19th century, infamous for the mysterious disappearances of those who had once owned his works. Legend had it that Merrick had dabbled in dark magic, channeling something unspeakable into his art. Each piece, it was said, contained a fragment of the artist's soul, asterisk, and the souls of those who came into possession of its star. As Alaric read through the accounts, his heart sank. The previous owners of Merrick's paintings had all experienced the same things: unexplainable changes in the art, vivid dreams, and ultimately madness. Some had disappeared completely, their whereabouts never discovered, while others were found dead, their eyes wide open in terror, as if they had seen something unimaginable. His hands trembled as he realized what this meant. The painting wasn't just a cursed object, it was a portal. The figure within it wasn't just watching him, it was trying to replace him, to pull him into its world and take his place in the real one. The more he interacted with the painting, the more the figure fed off his life, his memories, twisting them into its own. The painting was a trap, a slow, insidious prison from which no one had ever escaped. But the worst realization was yet to come. Alaric stood in front of the painting again, the house now even more detailed, almost photorealistic in its depiction. His eyes were drawn to a window, where he saw the faint outline of a man standing inside, looking out. His blood turned to ice. The man wasn't just anyone. It was him, asterisk, a perfect reflection of himself, asterisk, trapped within the painting, staring back with empty eyes, as though waiting for Alaric to join him. Panic surged through his veins. Alaric knew that time was running out. The painting was no longer just an object. It was alive, and it was coming for him. Alaric's mind spiraled into chaos, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He had read the stories, seen the fates of others who had fallen under Antonius Marek's curse, but nothing had prepared him for the creeping terror of knowing his life was being drained into the painting. Each passing moment, each flicker of shadow in his home felt like the hands of the figure in the painting clawing at the fabric of his reality. There was no one he could turn to for help, no one who would believe that a piece of art could bend the very laws of nature. But he had to try. He couldn't fight this alone. Desperation gnawed at him as he contacted an old friend, Dr. Elias Ward, a renowned art historian with a peculiar interest in the occult. Elias had spent years studying the mysteries surrounding cursed objects and had even hinted at the possibility of hidden knowledge within certain artworks. If anyone could offer a solution, it would be him. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky when Alaric finally heard the sound of Elias's car pulling into the driveway. He rushed to meet him, barely able to contain his anxiety. Elias was a tall, stoic man, his face etched with years of deep contemplation. But when he saw the look on Alaric's face, a shadow of concern passed over him. Inside the gallery, Elias stood before the painting, his eyes narrowing as he examined the shifting scene. The figure was now more prominent than ever, its features still obscured, but there was a distinct shift in its posture, as if it were closer to stepping out of the canvas entirely. The house in the background had grown unnervingly detailed, reflecting more of Alaric's life. "This isn't just any painting," Elias murmured, his voice laced with unease. "It's a tether, a bridge between this world and something else." Elias's words sent a cold shiver down Alaric's spine. As they examined the painting further, Elias shared what he knew about Antonius Marek. The artist had been obsessed with capturing the essence of life in his work, but when his natural talent failed to satisfy him, he turned to darker methods. Rumor had it that Marek made a pact with something far older, far more malevolent, imbuing his paintings with the power to steal the souls of those who admired them. Every brushstroke was a fragment of his victim's life, and every painting was a prison. "But why me?" Alaric asked, his voice trembling. "Why now?" Elias shook his head, the creases in his brow deepening. "It's not just you. It's anyone who lingers too long in the presence of Marek's art. These paintings, they pull you in. They devour your memories, your essence, until there's nothing left of you but a shadow, trapped inside forever." Alaric's mind reeled at the horror of it. He had been feeding the painting all along, unaware that every moment spent staring at it, studying it, had been draining him of his very soul. But the worst was yet to come. As Elias continued his investigation, his face grew pale. "There's a way out," he said cautiously, "but it's dangerous. You have to sever the connection between you and the painting before it claims you entirely. Destroying it might work, but Marek's magic is unpredictable. Sometimes, destroying the painting traps the victim inside forever. The other option is to confront the figure, force it to reveal itself, and reclaim your life before it crosses into this world." The words hung heavy in the air, their implications terrifying. Alaric stared at the painting, the figure inside now almost fully formed, its hand outstretched as if waiting for him. The room grew colder, the shadows darker, and the whispering voices that had plagued him for days returned, louder and more insistent. He knew what he had to do, but fear gripped him like a vice. Confronting the figure felt like staring into the abyss, knowing it would stare back. "What if it's already too late?" Alaric whispered, his voice barely audible. Elias placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "You don't have much time, Alaric. The longer you wait, the more it will consume. You need to act now, or you'll be nothing more than a reflection in that painting, lost forever." The urgency in Elias's voice snapped Alaric out of his paralysis. He couldn't let himself be consumed. But how could he face something so incomprehensible, so filled with malice, that had already seeped into the very essence of his being? That night, as the wind howled outside and the shadows in his home seemed to grow darker, Alaric prepared for the confrontation. The painting seemed to pulsate with a life of its own, its colors swirling ominously as if anticipating the final act. His hands shook as he lit a single candle, its flame flickering weakly in the oppressive darkness. He could feel the presence of the figure, the cold, insidious touch of it pressing at the edges of his mind. He had to face it. He had to end this nightmare before it claimed him entirely. As he stepped toward the painting, the air around him thickened, the whispering voices rising to a fever pitch. The figure inside the painting began to move, its hands slowly reaching out beyond the canvas. Alaric's breath caught in his throat as he saw it for the first time. Its face, now fully visible, was his own, twisted into a grotesque smile, its eyes hollow and empty, but filled with hunger. He was running out of time. The night was unnaturally still, the kind of oppressive quiet that only precedes something terrible. Alaric stood before the painting, heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The figure inside the canvas had almost fully emerged, its skeletal hand now breaching the edge of the frame, fingers curling as though reaching for him. The reflection of his own twisted face within the figure sent waves of nausea and terror through him. The painting no longer felt like mere art. It was a doorway, and something far more sinister was stepping through. Elias stood at the doorway of the gallery, watching with a grim expression. "This is it, Alaric," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising tension in the room. "You need to confront it now, or it will cross into our world." But Alaric couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. It had moved again, its body halfway out of the painting, its grotesque smile widening, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. The figure's movements were unnatural, jerky, as if it were breaking free from some invisible chains that had bound it for centuries. The air around it shimmered with dark energy, warping the space in the room, distorting reality itself. The whispers had become deafening now, filling the air with unintelligible murmurs, like hundreds of voices speaking at once, overlapping in an eerie symphony of madness. Alaric could feel the weight of them pressing on his mind, making it hard to think, to focus. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee from the abomination emerging from the painting. But he knew there was no escape. The figure wasn't just a part of the painting anymore. It was part of him. Its movements mimicked his. Its hollow gaze locked onto him with a malevolent intelligence. It knew his fears, his regrets, his secrets. The gallery seemed to pulse with life, the walls shifting as if the very fabric of the house was being pulled into the nightmare. Shadows danced wildly across the room, their shapes twisting into grotesque forms that moved of their own accord. Alaric's legs felt like lead as he took a hesitant step forward, the floor beneath him creaking unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The figure was almost fully free from the painting now, its form towering over him, its face now a perfect but horrifyingly distorted mirror of his own. "What do you want?" Alaric's voice was barely a whisper, his throat tight with fear. The figure didn't answer with words, but its smile widened, and in that moment, Alaric understood. The figure wasn't just trying to cross into his world. It was trying to replace him. It wanted his life, his body, his soul, and it was winning. The more Alaric looked into its hollow, black eyes, the more he felt himself slipping, as though the figure was siphoning away his will, pulling him into the painting, into that twisted, decaying world beyond the canvas. With a surge of panic, Alaric lunged toward the painting, desperate to stop it before it could fully cross over. His hands grasped the edges of the frame, but the moment he touched it, a searing pain shot through him, as if the painting itself was alive, burning him with dark energy. He screamed, but forced himself to hold on. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the figure was fighting back, its limbs thrashing as it tried to step fully into reality. Alaric's vision blurred, the world around him fading as the figure's presence became overwhelming. Suddenly, with a violent jolt, the figure stopped moving. Alaric's breath caught in his throat as the figure's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, it spoke, not with a voice, but through his own mind. Asterisk, I am you. You are mine. Asterisk, the words echoed through his skull, reverberating like a dark truth he had always known but never faced. The figure wasn't just some entity trying to replace him. It was him, a reflection of all his fears, his darkest desires, the parts of himself he had buried deep within. And now, it was claiming him. Alaric staggered back, his mind reeling. He had always thought of himself as an ordinary man, but now he realized the truth. He had drawn this creature to him. Through his obsession with the painting, with the darkness hidden within the art, he had invited it into his life. And now, it was too late. The figure was no longer just in the painting. It was inside him, merging with his very soul. Elias shouted something from the doorway, but his voice was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers and the rising hum of dark energy that filled the room. Alaric's body felt heavy, like his limbs were no longer his own. The figure stepped closer, its movements no longer jerky, but smooth, deliberate, as though it had fully claimed its place in this world. Alaric could feel its presence in his mind, twisting his thoughts, warping his reality. His reflection in the glass of the frame showed not his own face, but that of the figure, a grotesque, hollow version of himself, smiling with the satisfaction of victory. In that final moment, Alaric realized what was happening. The figure was giving him a choice: asterisk submit, or fight star. But fighting meant confronting the darkest parts of himself, the truths he had buried deep. The figure's hollow eyes bored into him, daring him to make the decision. Time seemed to stretch, every second an eternity, as the cold, empty void of the figure's presence filled the room. With a final surge of strength, Alaric made his choice. He reached for the painting's edge, determined to sever the connection before the figure could fully take control. But just as his fingers brushed the canvas, the room exploded with light, and everything went black. When Alaric opened his eyes, the painting was still. The figure was gone, but the reflection remained, a faint outline of a man standing in the shadows, waiting, watching. The nightmare wasn't over. The gallery was silent, the oppressive atmosphere that had weighed down on Alaric moments ago, now replaced by a suffocating stillness. The figure had vanished, but something lingered in the air, an invisible presence that gnawed at his senses. He staggered back, his body trembling, drenched in cold sweat, unsure if he had truly won or if the nightmare had merely shifted to a deeper layer of reality. The painting before him was motionless now, its surface no longer swirling with dark energy, but it was far from ordinary. The scene had changed again, subtly but unmistakably. The house was still there, just as detailed as before, but now the windows were dark, the lights extinguished. In the corner, barely noticeable, was a shadow, a faint outline of a man. Alaric's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure. Though it didn't move, he knew it was waiting, watching. A chill ran down his spine, the kind of bone-deep cold that no warmth could chase away. He couldn't shake the feeling that the figure had never really left. It was merely biding its time, lurking just beyond the veil, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. Elias approached cautiously, his face pale and tense. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice hushed, as if speaking too loudly might wake the darkness again. Alaric shook his head, unable to find the words. He didn't know if it was over. How could he? The painting may have stopped moving, but it felt like a ticking time bomb, like the figure could return at any moment, breaking through the thin barrier between their worlds. The reflection he had seen earlier, that twisted version of himself, still haunted him, etched into his mind like a scar. The realization gnawed at him. The figure hadn't just been inside the painting. It had been inside him. The gallery seemed to grow darker, the shadows longer, despite the sunlight that should have been streaming through the windows. Alaric glanced at the other paintings around the room, his heart sinking. They, too, had changed. Though the scenes were subtle, he could see it. The creeping darkness spreading through them, warping once beautiful landscapes into twisted, decaying versions of themselves. It was as if the figure had left a part of itself behind, corrupting everything it touched. Alaric could no longer trust his own eyes. Elias broke the silence. "There's more going on here than just a cursed painting, Alaric. I think Marek's magic was more than we understood. You may have stopped the figure, for now, but I fear this isn't over." His voice trailed off as he stared at the canvas, a deep unease settling in the pit of his stomach. "You're still connected to it." Alaric's pulse quickened. The thought that the figure was still with him, lurking just out of sight, sent waves of dread through his body. Every reflection he saw, every shadow that flickered in the corners of his vision felt wrong, like the world around him was slowly distorting, bending under the weight of something ancient and malicious. He couldn't escape it. The painting, the figure, whatever it was a part of him now, woven into the very fabric of his being. As the hours passed, Alaric tried to carry on with his life, but he couldn't shake the overwhelming sense that he was being watched. Every night, as he lay in bed, he felt the weight of unseen eyes, the whispers from his dreams creeping back into his waking world. The boundaries between reality and nightmare were dissolving, and he was helpless to stop it. He avoided the gallery as much as possible, but even in other parts of the house, he couldn't escape the shadows that seemed to follow him, twisting unnaturally along the walls. And then, one evening, something terrifying happened. As Alaric glanced at the mirror in his bathroom, he froze. His reflection stared back at him, but there was something off, something subtle yet horrifying. The reflection's eyes were not his own. They were hollow, black pits, just like the figure in the painting. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped back, but the reflection didn't move with him. Instead, it smiled, a slow, twisted smile that sent a wave of cold terror through him. He blinked, and the reflection returned to normal, but the damage was done. The figure was still with him, lurking in every reflection, every shadow, waiting for its moment to fully take control. Alaric realized then that the nightmare hadn't ended. The figure had crossed over, just not in the way he had expected. It wasn't bound to the painting anymore. It was bound to him. It was inside his mind, slowly eating away at his sanity, blurring the lines between what was real and what was a waking nightmare. He was no longer just a man haunted by a cursed painting. He had become part of the curse itself. The realization weighed heavily on him as the days turned into weeks. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker, and the reflection in the mirror less recognizable with each passing day. Alaric knew that his time was running out. The figure was waiting patiently, slowly wearing him down until there would be nothing left but a hollow shell, another victim trapped in Marek's twisted art. As the screen fades to black, we're left with the unsettling question: what happens when the art becomes you? Could you escape the grasp of something that has already claimed your soul? Or is Alaric's fate sealed, his reflection forever lost to the darkness? Let me know your theories in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories waiting to be uncovered, more nightmares lurking just out of sight. Stay tuned, and share your thoughts if you dare.